But welcome. This is another in a series of support-aware webinars. We'll get into what that is in just a second. I am your host, Eric Anderson. I'm your presenter. I am the other voice you'll hear. Aside from Donna, who I want to thank for arranging all this and getting the word out and getting this all coordinated and together. First, and I have to do a couple of these little things that we have to do to make sure everyone's aware who we are. We are Atlantic Data Security. I do not work for Checkpoint, as much as some of you may infer that eventually. I'm letting it be known right now. I work for Atlantic Data Security. We are a cybersecurity solutions provider, and that means a couple of things. I just want to make sure that people don't think of us as what the industry sometimes refers to as a reseller. I always will pinpoint or point out that we are a value-added reseller. From an engineering standpoint, we have much more involvement and excitement and pride in that value-added piece. And that's through providing services, not only the typical service engagements where we actually do deployment and support and planning and so forth, but making sure that it's all working properly, not just selling you a product because everybody thinks you need more products. We want to make sure you're getting value out of what you do have, and that's through a number of different services we provide. We'll talk about a couple of them in just a second, just to get through some preliminaries, but this is not a salesy presentation. I want to get that right out there. I'll reiterate that in a minute after I do a little bit of housekeeping. But we are also, when it comes to Checkpoint, one of very few, less than a handful of elite partners in the States. We are the only one that is either an MSP for managed security providing or an ATC, an authorized training center. All of the other, or the other handful, or less than a handful of elite partners don't provide either of those services as well. So we're pretty proud of that. We've gotten there through a strong commitment from our engineering team to maintain levels of certification, which you do through maintaining knowledge and staying up to date. Part of what we try to do also is ensure that our customers and our clients are up to date as well. And this is one of the ways we do that. The slides I want to show, make sure everyone, first of all, this presentation today is part typically of what we call support aware, which is just a service offering from Atlantic Data Security focused on making sure, again, that we are driving the value of the products you have through making sure that you are staying up to date, not only with versions and content, but knowledge. We can provide additional services as well, like reporting assessments, managing what we call life cycle and helping with updates. And again, just driving the value, making sure that you're actually getting what you need to out of not only the products, but the service agreements you have with us. Again, I don't want to linger on any of these. We also have what we call the service desk, or the VSOC service desk, which is a little bit more of a proactive kind of co-management service, not staff aug, but kind of helping, again, through those more proactive tasks in keeping you up to date and monitoring of your security infrastructure. Again, not to linger on them, but if you are curious about any of that stuff or don't know or hadn't heard, first of all, I'm surprised because we do try and make sure everybody's aware of what we do. You can feel free and reach out. I'll give contact information towards the end. You can also hit our website. This is, as I said, a support aware webinar. This is something we try to do quarterly. We have lapsed a little bit. That's mostly my fault in the last couple of quarters. Because of some things beyond our control. We won't get into and get political and start talking about what everybody's aware of in these strange, uncertain times. I won't say that again, but we're back. And the intent of these webinars is to provide actual education, not pitchy, not salesy. I want to actually give you information, something maybe you can learn from and use that's practical. Primarily, usually focused around Checkpoint because that's the majority of who the audience might be. We, just to back up a little bit, do provide other services and other products as well. Not entirely Checkpoint focused, but this particular webinar is. Our next one, just to get it out there, is scheduled for September 20th. Put it on your calendars now. We don't have a topic yet. I'm actually more than happy to field ideas and suggestions for topics. Generally, we wait a little bit longer until we know kind of what will be timely, what's in demand, and what we're seeing that's interesting. So hopefully we have a very clear direction as to the topic for September 20th, but we did want to get it out there so you can put it in your calendars now. You will get more information on this a little bit later. It'll be on our newsletter on our website. You'll likely hear about it well before. Other coming events, I do want to make everyone aware there is an event very soon, Checkpoint Secure, and I didn't put the date on here. I have the date. I wanted to double check. I meant to put that on the slide. I apologize. But this is actually a Checkpoint event where Atlantic Data Security is a platinum sponsor. I want to say it's early August. When is it? I'll put it up there. It's
August 23rd.
It's coming up. I'll get the date for you. But you can also check the website when you click on that link. Actually, I'll give you the link here. I am going to periodically throw some links into our chat. Everyone can see this. Hold on a second. So if you do want to get more information, I'm throwing the links into the chat because you can't click on slides. That event is something that we are a platinum sponsor of. There are, I think the last time I looked on the agenda, there are 4 different halls where they're doing different lectures and different presentations. A lot of that is educational as well. Some of it's Checkpoint patting themselves on the back, presenting, promoting. Very good information, I'm sure. But we are also sponsoring our own booth. Some interesting things I'm sure to find if you come to see us at the event. Beyond that, I would love to talk about training. I'm not going to linger on this at all, but we do run that authorized training through Checkpoint. There are some new courses that Checkpoint has introduced in the last year, or a couple of months even, around what they call specialist training. The specialist courses are all 2-day classes. There's a very interesting one for CloudGuard, covering both Azure and AWS and kind of CloudGuard in general, a little bit of Dome 9 in there. An automation course is actually a little bit older, been around for a little while. But the 2 that I'm most excited about are new troubleshooting classes. There's a troubleshooting admin and a troubleshooting expert course. They're both intended to be 2-day courses. I was actually involved in the development of these towards the end of last year. I'm pretty proud about some of the lab content we came up with. And the next run of this, the CCTA, we have scheduled for early August. It is an online-only course, so something to do from home while we're distancing. And it is a very interesting hands-on course, little kind of a introduction to some different troubleshooting aspects at the admin level to kind of go along with the CCSA course. If you've taken that or have interest in it, by all means, the CCTA is an interesting, valid add-on to admin level, either training or exposure and experience. Some interesting tips and tricks and cool hands-on procedures. And that, as always, of course, we offer other options for private and or custom training, and we can do that again on site now as well. So by all means, reach out. I'll give my contact information at the end of the class, or you can contact whoever it is you like to contact here at Atlantic, whether that's your account rep, engineering, or training at. We have plenty of different ways you can reach out to us and get more information on that. But let me move on to the stuff you're actually here for and what gets more interesting. Today, the basic topic is R80.40. We're going to cover some of the neat new things that Checkpoint introduced a few months ago in R80.40. We're doing it now because it's the dust is settled and things have stabilized enough, and R80.40 is now the recommended release. There's a jumbo hotfix available and a later take that makes things all up to date and stable. Early issues and anomalies have all been corrected, and we have seen great success. We, being Atlantic Data Security, has seen great success in .40 deployments with our client base, and of course in our own lab and for our own production. So it is definitely time to get everybody up to date. Not that everyone needs to upgrade, and I'm going to say this first. If you've taken classes from me or you've heard me talk about this in the past, I am definitely a subscriber to the theory of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm not saying everyone should go to .40. What I typically tell clients is look at the release notes, look at what's new, look at what's fixed. And if you find items there that are interesting or important to you or address problems you've had, then you should strongly consider upgrading. If everything's working, if you don't have any major problems, complaints, things are functional for you, then by all means, don't ruffle things too much. Stay where you are and at least stay up to support. And that gets a little bit interesting as well. Let me cover basic timeline. We talked about the last time we did one of these. I think it was an 80.20 update. What was new? We talked about some neat things that were introduced, and we mentioned at the time that R77 was going end of support. It did, I think, Q3 or Q4 last year. Checkpoint officially dropped support for R77. By then, hopefully everyone was on to R80.something. Not a big fear from here. Going forward, I believe the last I looked, R80.10 did not go in, or does not go end of support until I think May of 2021. So we do have a little while still before we have to worry too much about end of support for, and there I go messing up my ink, end of support. Sorry, for R80.10. But R80.20 did introduce a bunch of really neat new things. One of those that we'll hear a little bit more about today is what they called updatable objects, the ability for gateways to automatically add new sources and destinations effectively based on other external sources, whether that's through APIs or monitoring and other tie-ins that Checkpoint has put in to other providers, service providers that keep updated lists. I'll show you what that is again in a second. It's one of the things that isn't brand new, but we're going to revisit because it continues to expand. Major changes in 80.30 in stability and performance, as well as some interesting SSL inspection updates. But what we're going to focus more on now is what's new in R80.40. There's a bunch of things that are very interesting, very cool, but they're also not that great to show. Not that exciting and sexy, and there's not a lot you have to do for them. Things you can take advantage of, but I don't have to train you that much on them. But I do want to mention some of these things. For example, new kernel in Gaia. Major update under the hood completely, but Gaia does use a newer updated Linux kernel, which has led to some major changes in the way storage is controlled. New disk and partition capabilities, larger physical partitions, but also new partition schemes. The XFS file system improves performance of the file system significantly, as well as adding much, much larger partition support, up to, I want to say, 48 terabytes, which is significant. There's also been a lot of performance optimization within the kernel itself, making the operating system a lot faster. Major improvements there. Again, not anything sexy to show about it, but there are some changes. Also, at the command line in Gaia, they've expanded some of the troubleshooting tools. Things like CPView offer a little bit more insight, continue to expand and grow. There's also been a number of performance improvements in the gateways themselves. A lot more automation of tuning, of adjustments of core use, as well as things like multi-queue and dynamic dispatcher continue to get more let's say, aggressively tuned automatically and in the background. If any of you have been around Checkpoint for a very long time, remember many years ago, it wasn't super uncommon on a very high-end box or a very busy box to need to do more manual tuning and setting of SIM affinity and messing with cores on our own. More and more that becomes very automatic now, and Checkpoint does a much better job every release of optimizing the performance and optimizing the use of the resources we have. Priority queuing, for example, is another one of those things that has become a little bit more in the forefront and helps make sure that the right traffic is getting prioritized properly. They've also done some interesting things, again, that you might not see if you're not using MDS at all, but multi-domain has been historically a little bit difficult to flip between domains on a multi-domain server and standalone. Now it's actually a lot easier as of R80.40 to migrate or to backup and restore between a standalone management server and a domain management server. Kind of an interesting adjustment that's been made there. We've done that manually years in the past, had to do some fancy dancing to get, let's say, a CMA out of an MDS. But now there's a lot more automation, a lot more capability in there. A lot of changes in CloudGuard as well. They've done a lot to ensure smoother CloudGuard tie-ins, both in Azure and AWS, enhancements to load balancing, including geographic independence, use of tags within objects, and a lot of that, again, the load balancing refers to some clustering changes that have been made to allow CloudGuard to better utilize redundancy and high availability and load sharing, or load balancing, as they say here. There have also been some major improvements and enhancements in antivirus and sandblast. MITRE attack reporting is built in now as well. And there's a lot more, let's say, depth to what can be looked at. Changes in inspection of archives, a lot of enhancements in email inspection. Don't see a ton of that, but both POP and IMAP can actually be looked at a little bit more in depth for those who are allowing them. And performance has been tweaked quite a bit as well. A lot of changes in automation. API continues to expand. There's stronger, better, more reliable, and yet more flexible authentication options through certificates. You can also now, in the management API, manipulate, create cluster objects, something that was not possible before. It continues to expand. I'm not going to linger on how that goes. There's some more interesting things I want to get to instead. Another neat new thing you might hear about in some of the marketing around 80.40 is what they call zero touch. The idea of zero touch is to allow you to take new appliances, new acquisitions, send them out into the field, plug them in, and have them configure themselves. This is a little bit different depending on the type of device. The SMB devices, the embedded Gaia devices, those have hardware serialization in them and can be automated based on serial numbers within Checkpoint's portal to go through the individual config and profile that you want to apply to that box. Once that box is plugged into the internet and gets online, it will go and phone home and retrieve its configuration and provision itself. With full-blown Gaia boxes, like Checkpoint appliances, or open server, build your own, there's a little bit of a touch involved. I don't want to refute Checkpoint's claim of zero touch, but it's a very light touch. And part of that is because of the fact that Checkpoint still does support the open server model or concept where you can build your own appliance, you can build your own gateway. When you do so, there is no serialization. There's no way for Checkpoint to automatically be able to identify who owns this box and what config it should apply. On those devices, you can still do most of the config in the cloud based on some unique identifier, say for this appliance, for this device that I'm going to ship to this particular location, here's the config. Here's the answers to all of the initial config wizard questions that are asked, routing, IPs, DNS, so forth. Here's the initial SIC code I want to give it, as well as here's a Gaia Clish script to configure all the other interfaces and all the other static routes and everything I want on that box. The only thing that needs to be done on the device itself is to configure, and this can be done via console, the unique identifier that that device uses when it connects to the Checkpoint cloud to prove that this is the device that gets a certain configuration. Pretty straightforward. Very cool to see that actually working though, applying blink images, putting the version that you want on it, and automating that config in a pretty cool way. But that's the stuff that's harder to show, interesting, not worth spending as much time on. The stuff I do want to focus on a little bit more starts now. And this is the stuff that I can actually teach you a little bit about how to use. Most of this, for those who know me and have seen presentations I do, I prefer by far to do live demonstration. I like to live a little bit on the edge, push myself, test myself, and risk embarrassment. But for presentations like this, I typically will instead go through the demonstration in our own lab environments and capture screens to just help streamline the presentation and optimize our time a little bit so you're not waiting for things. So what you'll see on the coming slides are screen captures of procedures that we have run in our lab on a real system to capture live data, partly to capture visuals for you, but also to test and make sure these things work. Some of these things we don't use a lot, but when we do, we want to be able to speak with confidence. We, and when I say we, I typically mean we as an engineering team at Atlantic Data Security, have confidence that these things do work. Now, there are some caveats. One of the things I will put on these slides as well, which you can see at the bottom here, is whether or not these particular updates or capabilities require management to be on 80.40 or both management and the gateway to be on R80.40. The one we're going to start with here, as you can see, called SmartConsole Extensions. This is a feature that only requires management be updated to R80.40. Gateways can still be on previous versions. Essentially, it's a management feature. What is a SmartConsole extension? Well, first of all, how do we update or install SmartConsole extensions? These are things that maybe when Checkpoint updated SmartConsole or developed SmartConsole, didn't find essential, didn't find necessary, or someone else outside of Checkpoint may have even thought, there's a feature I'd like SmartConsole to have that it doesn't. Let me write it. And some of these, I think most at this point, have been written by Checkpoint personnel. But the intent is to be able to extend SmartConsole to have additional capabilities that I'm not even going to try and limit what they could be. There could be many different things that, that are enabled in here. Couple of quick, well, first of all, how they're deployed. Right within your management settings under preferences, you'll see a simple window for SmartConsole Extensions. When you hit the little plus, the next step is to give it a URL. The URL here is something you would find either in a link somebody sent you in an email or in web searching, especially through Checkpoint's community site. There's a lot right there now. And I am going to give links here. If you want to find some examples, I have another link to throw into the chat for you, which will bring you to a discussion on SmartConsole Extensions. There are a few there already. For example, just to bring up one simple example here, there is one that adds an interface topology tab to a gateway view. When you're in SmartConsole, and you'll see where I am here, is just looking at status of gateways. When I choose an individual gateway, there's now this additional tab called Interface Topology, and it lists all of the topology on the interfaces on this gateway right from that screen. You don't have to go in to edit the properties of the gateway. That was added through a SmartConsole extension. It goes from that all the way to much more extreme additions, like something Checkpoint calls Tailored Safe. This is actually an extension made by Checkpoint that does a lot of things. It's much more complex and much more robust. The intent of Tailored Safe is to actually go in and review, based on logs and visibility and report data, applications and protections that have actually been triggered. We've actually seen a particular attack or something that looks like attack, or we've seen certain applications in use, and then based on that information, adapt and adjust our policies and our profiles. Really kind of interesting. It's kind of an approach towards automating IPS tuning. And you have different options. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on a specific extension, but this one is another example of very, very robust coding that you could, in theory, write yourself as well. So on that website, again, if you go into Checkmates, there is an entire section devoted to SmartConsole extensions. You see Danny's created most of them, or at least posted them. I don't know who actually wrote them, but there's quite a few in there. You can also, as I teased a little bit, write your own. If there's something you wish SmartConsole could do, but it can't, and you want to figure out how to write it yourself, you can do that as well. And there's a link to the SmartConsole development guide. Not that I think most of us are going to get into that, but very intriguing concept. Another neat little addition to SmartConsole that is a management-only component is called SmartTasks. SmartTasks are intended to help us automate certain little features or little, well, I'll give you examples in a second, automate things from within SmartConsole itself. SmartTasks also show up under Manage and Settings in SmartConsole. So again, to kind of show how I got here, right within Manage and Settings in SmartConsole, at the very bottom is SmartTasks. And you can see I might have a list of SmartTasks that I've actually added or enabled. If you do want to create a new Smart Task, you click the little asterisk to create something new, just like we do elsewhere. It brings up this screen that allows you to create a Smart Task. Give it a name, turn it on, describe it if you want. Smart Tasks are basically made up of two components, a trigger and an action. Idea being I can choose when this task is actually triggered. Right now what we have for options here triggers either after a policy installation or before or after a policy or an update is published. And then the options I have for actions are either to run a script or send a web request. And if you think about it, those become very, very wide open in the possibilities. I'll give a couple of examples, but this is the basic idea of a Smart Task. Trigger either before or after publishing or after installing. And what do I want to trigger? Well, one example, and you can find some of these also on Checkpoint's site. I will throw up another link in a second here. But this is a very simple one provided by Checkpoint that has an extended script, and that script can be added in. You'll see that here. The script that's actually run validates that we provided a session name in a certain format. We can control the format via the custom data, and the task itself, the script itself, would dictate what that formatting looks like. It's typically in JSON. And this would be something that's done before we publish. So anytime somebody makes some changes and goes to publish a session, if they didn't actually give the session a proper name and or a description, we may want to force them to. And it's just one kind of example of a smart task that may force an additional action or do reviews. There are other smart tasks that can actually review the policy changes themselves and make sure people aren't doing things that are invalid. This becomes a little bit more involved, having to write some of the components yourself, or at least dictate the architecture, but a lot of it is there as well when you go look at the examples. Another interesting example, and I did this just to do it, you can, in theory, trigger external events as well. And if you look at the details on this one, the basic idea would be that anytime I publish a change, I want my lights to blink. If you do have smart devices, you can figure anything with if TTT, if this, then that. You could, in theory, have a link to trigger your lights blinking and have that post be sent every time we publish a policy or somebody publishes a policy. And that would be right through that HTTPS post. Not practical, but interesting. You think of all the other things you could do automatically during a publish, during an install, so forth. Another one that I do want to show, I mentioned earlier on, the idea of updatable objects, actually introduced in R80.40. Not new, but they do continue to expand. And if you haven't looked at the list of updatable objects in a while, you would see that there are quite a few new ones added all the time. This is something that was put into the code, and it does require gateway code, as you see down here. If the gateways aren't on 80.20 or newer, they can't take advantage of this, because what happens is if we enable these updatable objects in policy, that's essentially what we do, is we use them in a policy, something like Zoom services that you see here. That becomes an object we can put into a source or a destination in our policy. And if you think of policy architecture, sources and destinations are made up of IP addresses. Traditionally, they'd be static objects, either hosts, networks, groups, that are installed with the policy. And now that gateway has a policy that identifies sources and destinations, matches the IP address against a rule. Well, the difference with updatable objects, this is still an IP address. The destination is going to be a list of IP addresses, but the gateway has the code in it to automatically receive updates through APIs to what IP addresses are included in the Zoom services updatable object. And that's what's really intriguing. Most of these updatable objects will also give you information on the screen to pull up details on where this is sourced from. Typically, these are providers that are sourcing and listing and publishing constantly updated lists of IP addresses, and Checkpoint's simply tapping into that with APIs. So the information from Zoom is available there. And if we include that updatable object in our policy, as Zoom adds, removes IP addresses, our policy dynamically inherits those. We don't have to do policy installs. Again, if you've been around Checkpoint long enough, that seems like a really foreign concept, having things effectively change the way our policy is executing without doing an installation. But that's really the joy and the power of these updatable objects. Again, not to linger on the list too long, but you can see Azure and AWS are key among here, as well as Google services, and others do continue to get added. This mechanism, by the way, is also used by other components, a couple of which we're going to talk about as we go forward. So updatable objects are a good thing. Again, not brand new, but they do continue to expand. One of the areas that we see changes in every version, going back since HTTPS inspection was first introduced, continues to expand and improve in various ways to different degrees. One of the bigger things that you might hear about in the marketing and announcements for R80.40 is HTTP2 support. As the web evolves, so does inspection. But the bigger change for me, and I think one of the most interesting for our clients and what we've seen, is with R80.40, HTTPS inspection has been moved from a smart dashboard shared policy into SmartConsole as an actual layer. And you see this when you look at your policy package. You'll see that HTTPS inspection is now an actual policy layer, as opposed to having to launch Smart Dashboard and architect your single unified shared HTTPS inspection policy there. And that does a couple of things. One, first of all, we don't have to take the time to launch Smart Dashboard. But almost more importantly is it means we can have different HTTPS inspection policies for different policy packages. For different gateways, we can share them or have them independent. But also, it means that we can use objects that weren't available in Smart Dashboard. Things such as those updatable objects and even roles. So our policies now for HTTPS inspection, to back up a little bit for those who haven't played with it or haven't played with it in a while, I'm not going to get into the essence of what HTTPS inspection is or how important it is. It's not easy. And this is not a checkpoint problem, it's an industry problem. The more and more traffic that is encrypted and sent via HTTPS instead of good old clear text HTTP, the harder it is to inspect that traffic for all the wonderful reasons that we want to inspect it. HTTPS inspection affords us that insight that we so desperately want. Historically, again, for every vendor, this is a hard problem to solve because it shouldn't be breakable. But what we're trying to do is break it. The process of going through the policy to make this actually work for us and work properly can be a little bit involved. One of the things we often try to do is during the initial days of first turning on and enabling HTTPS inspection, we want to reduce the impact. We typically set our HTTPS inspection policy to bypass the inspection for all but a select group of test users. One of the ways we used to have to do that was in the policy for HTTPS inspection was to have a group or a list of static IP'd host machines. And we could put those into a rule that says bypass unless you're one of these IP addresses. So the rest of the population of our environment doesn't get inspected. They skip right past it. Everything stays encrypted. But for those test folks, now we'll continue on to the policy, ultimately, hopefully at the bottom, performing that actual inspection with our last rule. But now what we end up having to do is add some exceptions here and there for certain applications, certain sites that we either can't or don't want to inspect that traffic. Doing so now is a little bit easier because of these updatable objects and roles that we can utilize in our SmartConsole policy or our layer, such as roles, again, in the source. We can add our inspection testers as an identity awareness role, an identity awareness access role, and use that to define who's testing and who isn't, and all the wonderful things. If you're not familiar with identity access roles, we can talk about that another time. Happy to talk about any of this offline as well. And we can use those updatable objects, such as also domain objects and data center objects. It can be used, again, in source or destination. We couldn't do that before because these objects weren't available in Smart Dashboard. So that, for those who have played with or are working with HTTPS inspection, can be a very, very big change. Again, this does require the gateways also to be on 80.40 code. One of the other neat new ones that does somewhat relate to this and gets back into that updatable object discussion a little bit is a feature you've probably heard or seen in the marketing. They call it IoT security, the wonderful Internet of Things. For many of us, this doesn't matter all that much. In our corporate environments, we don't have or need to allow a lot of communication between things, or we can treat them just like we do other things or users or IP addresses. But in certain industries, this is vital, becoming more and more so, as we have, my favorite example, medical devices, which are hopping on our wireless and using our resources and need to be not only controlled, but allowed and identified properly. What Checkpoint's introduced with this IoT security component is the ability to tie into IoT controllers. And these are third-party products that we might snap into and authenticate into that are performing back-end IoT management, identification, authorization, authentication, and allow us to retrieve that information from that controller, as you see done here, tested, and it actually connected and identified the objects, but then allows us to take the data that comes back from that IoT controller and create our own, again, essentially dynamic objects based on those criteria. Whether we want to base this on manufacturer names, which you see here, here's a whole list of manufacturers of our IoT devices that our controller is aware of, or other criteria such as functions or risk levels. We can use that criteria then to create our own assets. And these lists of assets can be based on any of those different criteria, ultimately allowing us to put those objects into our rules. And it could be something, again, as simple as something that monitors blood pressure. And in this example rule, we're looking for any medical devices. So we source the information based on any of our IoT devices that perform any of these functions. And we can make sure that those are always allowed out. Again, this does tie into a third party, but that's where the real beauty of this is. Now, once we've done this, if somebody spins up another device, adds another blood pressure monitor to our network, we don't actually have to go and modify our policy to accommodate that. We're no longer adding a host object, adding it to a group, and doing a policy installation. This is something that is dynamically controlled in unison with that controller. Really cool concept, again, extending our abilities to adapt and do things automatically, but securely. There have also been some interesting updates to threat prevention. Some of this is just kind of a change in how we see things phrased and how we see things configured. But one of the simplest is through what they call these modes or threat handling modes. The idea here is they're using these new terms of rapid delivery and maximum prevention, kind of a lot of verbose and heavy syllables for basically either prioritizing speed and let's get your content to you fast before we emulate and then emulate on the back end, or no, let's make sure we've emulated it first and don't let you have it unless we're darn sure. This can also now be customized and differ between HTTP and SMTP, because often with SMTP, there's really no concern over a few second delay to do emulation, whereas web traffic, we want to see it immediately, so we perform the emulation in the back end. They've also, however, I will say, done a lot to improve the performance of threat emulation. It does get a lot faster. With 8040, that is, of course, a gateway function as well. One of the other changes, though, similar to HTTPS inspection, is that threat prevention now allows us to use dynamic, domain, and updatable objects in policy. Previously, we were limited in which types of objects we could use in our rules, but now what we'll see is within our threat prevention policies, we can use those same capabilities. So we can put dynamic objects, roles, into the source and or destination of our threat prevention rules, either allowing specific exceptions based on those or individual protections and profiles to be applied to different scopes. So that's a really interesting one to me. I'm a fan of being able to be more granular and have more control without having to make manual changes all the time using those dynamic objects. In the category of things we're finally happy to have back, things that we've been missing for a while, reverting to revisions. This is one that you remember from prior to R80, not to get into the architecture, but back when things were a lot simpler and we basically had our own simple files to control configuration, where all of our objects were statically defined in an objects.c or objects50.c file. And all we had to do if we wanted to make sure we could undo our changes was make a backup of those files. There was this revision control component in R77 and going back to R70, I want to say, that simply made copies of those files and allowed us to restore them if we wanted to undo all the changes we've made today that we messed a bunch of things up. We weren't sure how. We lost that in R80 primarily because the new database architecture is not as easy to make a simple copy of. The database-driven configuration where everything's stored in this relational database on the management server, it's not snappy to just take an image of that. So we lost that revision, revert ability. We have the ability to track revisions, but we couldn't revert to it. Well, 80.40 finally, and this is, I want to point out, a management-only feature. We do not need to have gateways updated for this. They've brought back the ability to revert revisions. It doesn't actually do what it did before, where it simply restores older versions of the files. What it does is manually undoes the revisions that we've done since. What you'll see is on our revision screen, and this is on our management screen. Again, when you go under Manage in SmartConsole and you look under Revisions, you see the list of all of the revisions you've done. We can choose a revision going back to yesterday, day before, 3 days before that. Right-click on a revision, and under Actions, we have the option to revert. This is basically going to now go through the deltas of every revision since and undo all of those things that we've done. Very cool to see it work. I typically don't like to go back more than a few revisions. Hopefully, by the time we've progressed this far, we've liked our changes. We don't want to undo them. It's more often kind of one, maybe two revisions back that we might want to undo. It does take a little while because it is actually making database calls to not undo or really overwrite, but make changes to records in the database. So that proper database architecture and use isn't instantaneous. It's not as fast as copying a couple of files. It takes a little while, but it is neat to see this be restored. Another very sort of involved section here. Upgrading. This is something that did receive a lot of love, and two different facets I'm going to talk about. One that I'm not really going to talk about much or show anything about is VSX upgrades. One of the things you haven't been able to do up to now is upgrade VSX from the web UI. You now can. CP use in the web UI on VSX does allow simple web-based updates. The one that I think is most interesting and has a lot of potential future ramifications for us is hotfixing right from within SmartConsole. This is a pretty easy one to illustrate, but I have a few more slides to kind of prove that this actually does work. This is also something that only requires management to be updated. We do not actually have to have gateway code beyond 80.40. I think it has to be at least 77.30, but again, that's out of support now. Everybody should be on 80.10 or newer for their gateways, and I can guarantee, and I will prove, that this also does work on R80.10. The idea is to simply, from our SmartConsole gateways and servers screen, identify a gateway that has a hotfix or a patch available. Right from that screen, right-click on it, and under Actions, and I'll zoom in a little bit here, select Install Hotfix. Seems pretty simple. Doesn't get much simpler. What will happen is the next screen will pop up and say, okay, here's the recommended or available hotfix, if there is one. It'll show it, it'll list it. We can say, yes, I want to install the recommended jumbo hotfix, this one that you found right here. If I say go ahead and continue, it will. If I want to install one that it can't find on its own, for example, if my gateway version is R80.10, I can actually provide the name, and this would actually come right from the SKs or from any links. It's not actually the link to the file. You just provide the name of the file in here. When you hit validate, it will go out, checkpoint site, find the file, verify that that's a proper file for this version, for this device, and allow you to go ahead and continue the install. Very cool, very simple, and it will work. Done it a few times, and it's definitely a neat thing to see added to the capability. One thing I do want to show that I think is almost more interesting than this applied to a single gateway is right here. You'll notice I'm actually doing this to a cluster now. And this is, in this example here, an R80.10 cluster. And if you're familiar with how clustering works, the whole idea of failing over is great, but we try and minimize that. We don't want to fail over if we don't have to. We want to keep the active member active. When we upgrade a cluster, whether it's a major version upgrade or a hotfix, if we do both boxes at the same time, when they both reboot at the same time, we're going to have a bit of a challenge. We're going to have some expanded downtime. With clusters, even this automated hotfix tool does it the correct way. And if you monitor this while you're upgrading a cluster, you'll see it actually runs the procedure as a cluster, one member at a time. It'll start with the standby member, wait until it's completed, the upgrade's been applied, reestablish sync, fails itself over, and then upgrades the other member. And it can do this fairly easily because we're still talking about the same major version. It's still R80.10, it's just a hotfix. So we don't have the typical issues we do with a version upgrade where sync doesn't work between different versions. So this is kind of an interesting one for me. And you'll see this does actually work, and it will perform all the necessary actions on its own to make that failover happen cleanly and upgrade or apply that hotfix to all members of the cluster. I say all because it could be more than two, typically wouldn't be. But that's kind of a neat one. And another very interesting note, you can actually have this being run on more than one gateway at a time. I did it just to see if I could, and it worked. I was able to upgrade both the standalone gateway and a cluster at the same time. Management kind of managing both simultaneously. You couldn't even do that in the past with good old Smart Update. So this is kind of a neat, I don't know why you would, I might not. I will mention there is still what they call a central deployment tool. That is still more of a command line driven tool. You can use that for hot fixes or large scale updates and deployments. Very, very cool, very capable. Not something I can really get into here, but if you are curious about that and automating larger numbers of updates or upgrades, by all means, reach out. Happy to talk about that a little bit offline. Along these lines, aside from hot fixing, there has been a rather, I don't know, I want to say low profile, but for me, very interesting improvement made to version upgrades. This is just hot fixes. I'd like to think that at some point before too long, version upgrades will be included in here as well, but they're starting slow. But when it comes to version upgrades, historically, there's been this challenge when upgrading a cluster. Not a big challenge, but the idea of upgrading a cluster means, as we mentioned, if you apply a new version to the standby member and then reboot that box, he's now on a new version and he can't really easily synchronize with a partner who's on a different major version number or even minor version number. R80.10 to R80.40, for example, won't work. There's been a procedure that we've had for years, went through a couple different names, from full connectivity upgrade to just connectivity upgrade, where you can run a manual script on the upgraded member that essentially forces it to dumb itself down to the previous version so that sync can occur. We can fail over and then upgrade the other member without ever really having any downtime. It was clean, worked, not that difficult, but a little bit more involved. What they've done is made this a little bit easier, made it a little bit cleaner. So what we end up having now is a feature they call multi-version clustering. What this effectively does is gives us a new command. There's actually some other modified commands you'll see here. Moves a lot of this, and you'll see this in 80.40. A lot of things have been modified and moved into CLISH. Things that we might have had to go to expert mode or to bash before to run at the firewall level, we can run in CLISH. One of those is the new command show cluster state. Instead of having to do our good old CPHA prob stat in expert mode, we can run show cluster state. Runs the same thing, but shows us even more information. It'll show us our recent failovers, reasons, times, all that wonderful information. Really neat to see. What you're seeing here, you have to trust me on this one, is cluster state on a secondary member after updating him from 80.10 to 80.40. He's now running a new version. What he's actually showing is that, yeah, I'm ready. And that's what we typically would see, is this ready state on an updated member, not standby, because he can't synchronize with his peer, because the peer is still on an older version. We used to have to go through that whole procedure of installing the policy, doing a failover, and a little dancing, running that script to get our synchronization to occur between different versions. Now we have this wonderful new little command called cluster member MVC. If we set our multi-version clustering on, our gateway now effectively detects the version of his peer, his partner, his buddy, reports himself as that version, and we get a wonderful happy status on our clustering. You'd see this in SmartConsole as well. You would actually see different versions, but you would see green checkboxes indicating that clustering is happy, synchronization is occurring. We can now fail over easily, or just start the upgrade on the other active member and not worry about that downtime. Really, really neat little functionality built into clustering to make things a little bit cleaner, to maintain uptime during an upgrade. Again, for me, very cool. Hopefully some of you think that's interesting as well, if you've done it. Let's see. Last but not least, and this is my last, I do want to leave a little time for questions, review the questions that have come through. I think we've had some of my teammates have answered some already, but in the VPN space, one of those interesting little things we've dealt with for many, many years is a limitation within VPN domains. Historically, Checkpoint has had a single VPN domain setting per gateway. When you're editing the properties of a gateway, we define the VPN domain of that box, which says here are all of the IP addresses that this particular gateway could possibly share with VPN peers. That's defined either based on the topology or based on a group that we throw into that gateway's definition. The only different option we have is for remote access, which might have a subset or a superset of what's available for site to site. The challenge this would cause for us is if we have some VPN peers that only want to tunnel with a certain VLAN or a certain subset of our IP addresses, we couldn't define a different VPN domain just for that peer. I won't get into vendor names, but others like to be very, very specific and granular. Checkpoint likes to say, hey, here's everything I have. I want to share it. I want to be able to share it all with you. My policy and my rules might be very restrictive. Doesn't mean you can get to everything. It's just here's all the theoretical possibilities. And sometimes that made VPN establishment a little bit, I'll just say, tricky. Simple workaround to that has often been to use VPN tunnel sharing within our site-to-site community, limiting it to individual subnet pairs, each getting their own tunnels. So when that vendor tried to tunnel with me and he only wanted to get to one particular range of IP addresses, that's all I would negotiate with him, and I wouldn't try and force my entire topology down his throat. Often worked, sometimes maybe not. There were some other little workarounds and things we had to do. Well, I'm here to tell you, finally, R80.40, one of the things and I know others in my team have been looking for many, many, many years, we can have different domains for different communities on our gateways. You see a list here with this particular gateway. He's a member of 4 different communities, and each one has its own unique VPN domain definition. So when I'm negotiating during phase 2, to get a little technical, of my VPN establishment with each peer, I'm going to use a different VPN domain when I negotiate the security associations based on the community that that peer is in. This, for those who've struggled with it in the past, is huge. You've likely worked around it, and we've got other methods to deal with it. But going forward, this is a much cleaner and better way of having unique VPN domain definitions per gateway, per community. So that's one that I save my favorites for last, because it's one that I won't get into how many years I've been doing this. This is one we've been looking for a very long time. With that, that is all I have for you. Like I said, I didn't want to go long. We didn't. We still have a little bit of time for questions. I would love to hear, and whether it's now or it's offline later, by all means reach out. Oh wait, I have 2 other links I didn't post for you. Let me put a couple more into the chat here. I did have examples for SmartTasks and and a link for more information on MVC. So there's a link to examples of SmartTasks and the multi-version clustering document that gets into kind of the procedure and the process to running upgrades of clusters without any downtime using MVC. So there's a couple more links. There's a few there in the chat for you. The other one I do want to give everyone would be, well, you should all have email addresses. I will put up on the screen as well here. I will throw it right out there. I'll invite you to send email to me directly. If you have questions about anything we saw that we looked at here, you want to take it offline, by all means. More than happy to try and field questions in the next day or 2 related to what we covered, or start other discussions. Reach out to anyone at Atlantic Data Security. If any of this is interesting to you, you want more information, you want to see it, you want to explore it with us, you want to get upgraded, definitely something to talk about. You want to talk about training. I will go back to the slide because I do want to urge you all, share with me other things you've found that are cool. I love to learn. One of my favorite things about teaching is learning. I like to hear from others what they've done, what they've seen, and learn from their experiences as well. So share with me what you've run into. Also share with what you'd like us to do in the future with our webinars. If there's anything else you'd like to see specifically or very generically, share it with me directly, share it with anyone at Atlantic Data Security. Hopefully it'll get back to me, get back to our team. But by all means, this shouldn't be the end of discussions. I hope it's just the beginning. Hopefully some of that stuff was interesting. You can find value in it. And I'm going to pause for a second and see if there's any questions that I can answer.